Okay, so we are starting a new module today. We're starting a new topic. Uh, we're now past questions about duty to obey the law and the right to resist the law. We're moving on now to the question of paternalism. So I'm going to say a little bit about the general topic first, and then we'll move into the reading for today, which was Mill. So paternalism is interference with someone's liberty in order to benefit them in some way, to make them happier, to make them healthier, and so on. That sort of is the idea. Paternalism is a justification for a number of different kinds of laws, as we'll see as we go throughout this module. Some examples that you're probably familiar with: seatbelt laws, prohibition of suicide, prohibition of using certain drugs. We'll discuss a lot more examples as we read Mill and Dworkin, and then later we're going to focus on one particular example, which is the prohibition of the sale of human organs. Okay, so moving on to talking about Mill. So I understand that the Mill reading for today was quite long, and I'm sorry for that, but unfortunately there wasn't much I could do to get all the points that we needed from Mill for the theoretical basis that we're trying to build here, and also do so in such a short period of time. So unfortunately this is just a very long reading. So I'm going to sketch out some of the main points that Mill talks about in his piece, and then I will, I'm always open, of course, for discussion for people who are watching live. So the first thing that I wanted to get right from the start, and this is why I started you with part of the introductory chapter, is the main principles that Mill is building his argument on. And the principle that he's going to be defending in this piece has come to be known as the harm principle. And the harm principle says that the only legitimate purpose for exercising power over any individual by society is to prevent harm to others, right? So, one thing that this definitely excludes is exercising power over someone for their own good, right? So the harm principle is a direct rejection of paternalism. Mill says someone's own good is never a good enough reason on its own to compel them or interfere with their liberty. It's a good reason, he says, to try to persuade them or reason with them, right? But it stops there. You can't go beyond mere persuasion and reasoning with them. If you try to compel them, either by the force of law or by organized public disapprobation or social ostracism, right? That's not permissible, according to Mill. Now, you can personally, as he said, privately, it's fine for you to disassociate with people who you think are making bad life choices. Maybe you think they're unpleasant to be around. That's perfectly fine, according to Mill. But once you make it a public campaign, then he thinks that you've stepped over the line. And of course, Mill says that this principle is limited to capable adults, right? Children, people with Alzheimer's, and so on, they should be protected, according to Mill, to a greater extent, and their decisions not given as much weight. And you'll see that when Mill argues for the harm principle, why that would be. They're not going to satisfy a lot of the conditions that he thinks makes the harm principle a good one for capable adults. So the other main point that we get from the introduction is that Mill is not going to try to rest this argument on some abstract idea of rights. He's not going to assert that people have a natural right to liberty, as someone like Locke might have. but rather he is going to argue that the harm principle will produce greater overall good for all individuals and society as a whole. That this is a principle that is beneficial to everyone's welfare, not just an appeal to some sort of natural right. So for Mill, that's very important because Mill is a utilitarian. Okay, so moving on to Chapter 4, Mill gives a number of arguments in this chapter for the harm principle, and I will go through each of them and give the sort of broad outlines of them and talk about a few of the details. So his first and one of his main arguments for the harm principle is that people are individuals are better at advancing their own interests than are third parties, right? And he gives, and especially society at large. And so he gives a few different reasons to think this is true. The first one is that people know best what's in their interest. They have direct access to their own preferences, to their experience of pleasure and pain, and have the most information about their individual circumstances. Others, even close family and friends, don't really have that kind of access, and they don't usually. Most people, even close family and friends, don't know you better than you know yourself, is Mill's idea here. And he says, but certainly, even if your close family and friends might know you better than you know yourself, it's still definitely the case that society at large, the voting public, does not know you nearly as well as you know yourself. So you have a better access to the relevant features of your situation in order to inform your decision making than would the voting public, who would be imposing laws upon you to tell you what is best. The second reason is that individuals have a special interest in their own well-being, greater than they have an interest in the well-being of others, especially strangers. So your loved ones might have a strong interest in your well-being. They might care a lot about how you are doing. But the voting public at large, again, does not care that much about you as an individual. They might care about you as a member of society, but as an individual with your own individual ends and goals, they don't care nearly as much about those as you do yourself. Right? You can think about how much you care about a random stranger's goals on a particular day that you might be walking by. You probably are not going to expend a lot of energy figuring out the best way for them to do whatever it is that they're trying to do, accomplish whatever tasks they have. So his third reason, moving on, is that society and laws have to deal in generalities, while individuals can address their specific case more accurately. So his idea here is that people have a lot of individual circumstances that might make what's generally bad for people good for them in a particular case. So because you're able as an individual to deal with the specifics of your case, Mill thinks you have a better chance of getting it right than society making a general rule for everyone. And the last reason that he gives for this claim that people are best at advancing their own interests is that it's part of a person's well-being and happiness to be self-directed and to be free and not subject to the authority of others when making decisions about their life. So he thinks that it's just a constitutive part of what it is to be happy and live a good life, that you get to make the important decisions about your life, that you're not under the power of other people. So he thinks, even if other people did know better than you, there still would be a value in you making your own decisions, right? Because that's just part of what it is to live a good life, according to Mill. Okay, so moving on to his second argument for the harm principle, He says that people who ruin their own lives through bad decisions shouldn't be the target of our anger and resentment, but of our pity. We ought to try to help them better themselves, but we shouldn't treat them as enemies of society. And Mill says when we punish them like criminals, when we treat them as criminals, when we pass laws that prohibit their behavior, we're engaging the mechanisms that we use against the enemies of society, not against people who we're trying to better, not against people who we pity. Punishment is inappropriate, he says, because it serves only to worsen people's lives and not to better them, when our goal should be to better people's lives. Now, an obvious response to this is the idea that, well, the punishment isn't there to actually be exercised on them. Rather, our hope is that the threat of punishment will deter people from making bad decisions. Mill doesn't have a direct response to that in here, but we can think about what his response might be. So when you're reading over this, think, what would Mill say to that sort of objection to his argument? Okay, so moving on to his third argument here, Mill says that there's a prominent objection that says, look, the problem with drunkenness, with gambling, with lots of the vices that people want to regulate or prohibit, is that those sort of bad habits and behavior tend to cause people to fail to meet their obligations to others. Right? If you have a gambling problem, you will have trouble providing for your family, meeting the debt obligations that you might have, all sorts of things like this. The same with if you have a problem with drinking and drugs and so on. And Mill says that under these circumstances, someone could be punished either in the form of a legal punishment or by social pressure. But it's not for their habits that they should be punished, Mill says, but rather for their failure to follow through on their obligations. So he points out that it doesn't matter why you fail to meet your obligations, your debts, your duties to provide for your family. Even if you were doing it for very prudent reasons, for or admirable reasons. Maybe you were giving to charity, maybe you were trying to set up a business. These reasons still, we could rightly punish you for failing to meet your obligations to creditors, to family members, and so on. So Mill says there's no special case here with people who are engaging in bad behavior. It's just like any other reason that you might fail to meet your obligations. And so given that, again, there's no reason to engage in paternalism. There's no reason to prohibit these bad behaviors because the problem of failing to meet your obligations is one which it's distinct from the problem of having bad habits. The fourth argument that Mill gives is that when you try to control people too much, when you go beyond the reasonable limits that he thinks the harm principle sets, beyond what society rightfully cares about, according to Mill, which is you going out and harming other people, it becomes stylish for people to rebel against that control. So he thinks that a motivation that many people have for engaging in these destructive behaviors is a rebellion against those who would control them by prohibiting those behaviors. And so he thinks that you often worsen the problem of these bad habits rather than solving it through prohibition. Okay. His fifth argument is that it's better that those who choose self-destructive behaviors be left to do so that there can be no confusion for third parties about the reason that their life goes poorly. If something is in fact bad for someone and self-destructive, and they engage in it, their lives are going to go poorly. That's just what it is for something to be a bad habit, for it to be self-destructive. But when you punish people for these bad choices, it becomes less clear to others who aren't engaging in those behaviors, and even to the people who are themselves engaging in those behaviors, whether it was the habits that were bad and causing these problems in their life, or whether it was being punished for those habits, which is making their life go poorly. So you can imagine, suppose that we threw people in jail for eating vegetables, right? It wouldn't be the case that eating vegetables is in itself a behavior which causes your life to go poorly. Rather, it's just the punishment that does that. And for people who are unclear about, say, the use of drugs or excessive gambling and so on, whether those are in fact bad for your life, it doesn't help to muddy the natural examples that exist in society by punishing people and by making it unclear whether the bad comes from the behavior or the bad comes from the punishing of the behavior. Right? So Mill thinks that these sort of different ways of living give information to everyone else who can observe them, and you're destroying some of this information by prohibiting it and punishing those who do it. His sixth and final argument is about the nature of democracy. And so Mill says, when we vote, we do so with the strongest respect for our own interests and not for the interests of others. And Mill thinks this is perfectly fine. He doesn't think that we should, when we're voting, always be thinking just about the public interest. He thinks that, in fact, one of the reasons democracy works in the cases where we're voting on appropriate things is that people are voting in their own interest. And so, for questions that affect all of society, Mill thinks we can expect that people voting in their own interest is going to produce the sort of outcomes that we want, where we improve the lives of the majority of people. But he thinks that when we start voting about self-regarding behavior which doesn't affect other people in society, which isn't about the questions of society at large, the majority is going to end up usually tyrannizing a minority, an unpopular minority. So you can imagine if everyone's voting in their own interest, when we're voting on questions that affect everyone, then the majority is going to the majority opinion is going to be the one which is in the interest of the majority of people. But if we're voting on things that don't affect everyone, that only affect individual people, then the majority expressing their preferences or their interests is often going to end up making some people worse off without making anyone else better off. Right? That's Mill's idea here. So the last thing I want to talk about in chapter 4 is a clarification that Mill makes about what he means when he says harm. So harm, according to Mill, does not include mere offense. If someone's offended by a person living, say, in a way that their religion forbids, Mill is not going to count that person as being harmed by the person who's living in that way, right? Harm for Mill is something like destruction of your property, harming your body, assaulting you, anything like that. That's the sort of harm that Mill has in mind. So he gives a couple examples of things that he doesn't, that he's not talking about. One of them is that Puritans in his time found it offensive, and perhaps we could say in a broader sense of harm that they were harmed by other people dancing, playing music. But Mill says that this offense doesn't count as a harm in his sense, in the sense that the harm principle is talking about. It doesn't justify laws against these practices. So the harm principle is not isn't taking such a broad definition of harm. Rather, it's focusing harm more on a kind of boundary crossing, where someone is engaging in something like theft, burglary, destruction of your property, trespassing, assault, murder, rape. These sort of activities he thinks are going to count as harm in his sense, but things that are just merely offending other people don't count as harm. And we'll see in chapter 5, which I'm going to talk about next, he also has some other clarifications for what exactly he means when he's talking about the harm principle. So moving on to chapter 5, Mill talks about some applications of his harm principle to policy. That's like the idea of the chapter. But in fact, this is more like a chapter where he's making clarifications and also making, you might call them exceptions to his general principle, or at least the most natural interpretation of his general principle. So first, a quick clarification. So the harm principle does not say that anything that harms someone should be legally prohibited, right? Mill doesn't want to say that at all. He's saying merely that harming someone can be a justification. It's one thing that can be a justification for prohibiting something. So he says that there are some cases like succeeding in a competition, being successful in business to the extent that others lose profits, marrying someone that someone else loves, and so on. You could reasonably call this harming someone, but he doesn't think that society is justified in punishing you for that. He thinks that those are legitimate ways to engage in society, and the sorts of harms that they're doing, the ways that you're doing harm to people is not a way that society should rightly prohibit. The harm principle doesn't in itself rule them out, right? The harm principle is mostly just there to rule out paternalism. But he's saying that you shouldn't read the harm principle as insisting that those sort of things be prohibited, right? So let me go on then, just because of the way the chapter goes, to some of the exceptions to the principle, to the harm principle, or exceptions to a natural interpretation of the harm principle, what they might include according to Mill. So the first is labeling. So he thinks that items that are dangerous, like poisons, for instance, ought to be labeled as dangerous and done so clearly. And his idea here is that labeling doesn't diminish someone's liberty. It doesn't in any way prohibit or substantially regulate the use of poisons or the purchase of poisons. All it does is give people more information or warnings about what it is that they're buying. And he thinks that there's no reason to think people wouldn't want that anyway, right? He thinks that people would want to know if an object they're buying is dangerous, so it's perfectly reasonable for the government to require that dangerous things be labeled as such. He also thinks that it's reasonable to require that dangerous items be registered. So, again, he's using the example of poisons, but you could imagine him talking about guns, weapons of all kinds, things that have the ability to be used in crimes. So you could even think about lockpicks, for example. He thinks that if it served a good purpose in crime fighting, it would be reasonable for those things to be registered. So when you bought it, he suggests perhaps the seller would have to record down your name, your address, when you bought it, for what purpose you said you're buying it for, and so on. And this is, he thinks, not a restriction on your liberty, because you're still permitted to buy it. You don't have any regulations on your purchase of it exactly. It's just there to give evidence in case such a device or item was used in the commission of a crime. He thinks that for dangerous items, it's reasonable to allow the police this sort of evidence to be available to them. And this is part of society's legitimate purpose of protecting people from those who would do harm to them. He also thinks that it's reasonable to impose special restrictions on individuals after they've committed a crime. So he gives the example of, suppose someone committed a crime while drunk, and their drunkenness contributed to their motivation to commit that crime. He thinks that it would be permissible for a court, as part of their punishment for their crime, to restrict them from ever becoming drunk again, or punish them more severely if in the future they commit a crime while drunk. And he thinks, again, this is part of society's legitimate purpose of prevention of further crimes. But he thinks that it's limited here, notice, only to people who have in fact committed crimes while engaging in bad behaviors. Engaging in bad behaviors themselves, even if we think that there is a tendency for drunk people to engage in more crimes, that in itself, according to Mill, is not enough. They have to actually have committed and been convicted of a crime for this sort of special restriction to be legitimate. The next point, and this is one which I think is the closest to a very real exception to his principle, and this is that Mill says that some things, when done privately, are perfectly acceptable, but if they're done publicly, would be a nuisance and indecent. And so he thinks that doing these things in public can be rightly prohibited. So I imagine what Mill has in mind here are things like laws against public nudity, public sex, things like that. But this principle could end up being very restrictive, as you can probably imagine. And it's a possible weakness, I think, in Mill's account here of the sort of exceptions to the natural interpretation of the harm principle. So you could imagine, for instance, a very racist society could exist where most people find it very offensive and it's considered indecent in polite society for interracial couples to display themselves as couples, to hold hands, to talk to each other even, and so on. Now, Mill, of course, would say that you don't harm anyone by being in an interracial couple, and so the government can't rightly prohibit it. But it's not clear, based on what he says here, that in a very racist society they couldn't prohibit any displays of this fact in public, which seems unduly restrictive, at least from my point of view. So Mill here would have to perhaps say a lot more to prevent his principle from spinning out of control to the ability for the government to prohibit just about anything from being done in public. Right? We wouldn't want to require that everyone retreat to private places in order to engage in any behavior that society at large might think is uncouth or indecent, given that societies can often have very bad preferences, very bad ideas. So his fifth one is another one which I think is perhaps a very serious exception to how you would think that the harm principle would work. And this is that Mill thinks that it may be legitimate to prohibit the advertisement of certain negative habits. So he thinks that advertising for gambling houses, drug dens, brothels, and so on might rightly be regulated. And even if all the habits being advertised shouldn't be prohibited, which I don't think he would think any of those should be prohibited, still he thinks that advertising might be rightly prohibited because it has a kind of effect on people's morals, that it's an encouragement to to engage in bad habits, and Mill thinks that maybe that should be prohibited. I don't think he comes down clearly in On Liberty, but the idea that it might be okay to regulate is a pretty serious, I think, exception. The last exception is one where you are creating a contract or some sort of definitive way of I don't know how to put this exactly. So the sort of thing that Mill has in mind is a contract to be a slave for someone else. So that you give over all of your liberty to them, and in exchange for... we could imagine a circumstance where someone might be willing to do this, right? It sounds outlandish, but suppose that you were poor and your child had a very serious illness, but it was very expensive to treat, and you just you would never have a way to pay for this treatment, or at least not in time. But there's some eccentric person, eccentric billionaire, say, who is really interested in the idea of having a slave, and they're willing to pay completely for your child's treatment. You might reasonably think that it's the right thing for you to do, to enslave yourself to this person in exchange for saving your child's life. But Mill says that we should rightly prohibit those sort of contracts from existing because he says that an action which eliminates all of your future liberty can't possibly be one which is conducive to liberty overall. Right? Now, there's trouble with this, and we'll see that later in Dworkin. When we read Dworkin for tomorrow, you'll see that he tries to make a lot of hay out of this exception. So this is one where it could be the thin end of a very large wedge, which would get a lot of paternalism in the door. But anyway, it's what Mill says. So let me just give two more clarifications that Mill gives, and then I will be done with the lecture portion. If anyone has questions, of course, feel free at any time to post them in the chat. So during his discussion of the poison case, buying poison, he gives a little clarification. He says that if someone's about to do something which we have very good reason to believe that they do not intend to do and would be very and would cause serious injury to them, we can act to stop them if there's no way of telling them about this consequence in time for them to make their own decision. He says that this isn't a violation of the principle because we expect that they didn't actually desire to have that outcome. They just weren't aware of it, right? So, of course, afterwards, if they rebuff us and they say, "What are you doing? I was intending to do that. I was intending that consequence," then we would have to let them continue, right? The principle would say we have to let them, So his example is someone who's, I believe his example is someone who's about to walk on an unstable bridge, which will collapse under their weight and lead them in a river. Mill says it'd be fine if you can't yell out to them in time to just sort of tackle them to the side and prevent them from walking on the bridge. But if the person, after you tackle them, says, "What are you doing? I was trying to get on that bridge," and you say, "That bridge is unstable, you'll fall through," and they say, "I know, that was what I was trying to do, is collapse the bridge," then, questions about whether it's permissible to collapse an unstable bridge aside, it wouldn't be permissible for us to stop them from doing that. If we know that they know what they're doing and they intend the result, then the harm principle kicks in. It's just that in a case where we think they don't actually, we have very good reason to believe they don't actually know what's about to happen, we can stop them instead of just trying to reason with them if that's not possible in the circumstance. Okay, so one further clarification that comes up is when Mill is considering the taxation of various bad habits, drugs, for instance, for the purpose of making them harder to obtain. And Mill says that this is really only different in degree from their prohibition. He says, and this is a quote, "Every increase of cost is a prohibition to those whose means do not come up to the augmented price, and to those who do, it is a penalty laid on them for gratifying a particular taste." So Mill doesn't say that bad habits can never be taxed. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that they can't be taxed for the reason of making them more difficult to get, right? So this is before the official prohibition of marijuana in the United States. This is how marijuana was prohibited, is it was taxed at such an obscene rate that no one would have actually paid the tax. The tax was like 100 times more expensive than the marijuana itself. So that was intended not to raise revenue, right? That wasn't the intention of that tax. The intention of that tax was to prohibit marijuana without actually engaging in the efforts of prohibition, just to prohibit it by way of making it too expensive. So Mill thinks that that sort of thing is not an acceptable way to sort of get prohibitions in through the back door. Any sort of increase in cost just for the purpose of making it more difficult to obtain, he thinks, is a form of paternalism, is violating the harm principle. Okay, so that's all in Mill. We have at least one person watching right now. Are there any questions from the people watching? I should also say, not very many of you have taken the Module 1 exam yet. Remember that it's due tonight. You should expect for it to take you about an hour to do. A few people have already taken it, and that's good, but the majority of you have not. So make sure that you do take that by the end of tonight, because it's a very significant portion of the overall grade in the class. Also, I posted last night the Module 2 entrance quiz. I got it up a little late, so I'm giving you until tomorrow at 1 p.m. instead of, usually it would be due Monday at 1 p.m. before the lecture starts, but I'm giving you a little extra time because I forgot about posting it myself, and so I posted a little late. It's very quick, just like the first entrance quiz. It's just 4 quick questions asking your opinion. It'll be useful for getting you thinking about the relevant issues. Okay, well, it looks like there are no questions, so I will stop here and talk to you tomorrow.